right. Well, friends, as we begin today, we're continuing to look at the book of Romans. Romans is my favorite book in the Bible. I'm going to tell you that over and over again. And when we go to the next one, that will be my favorite one when we're in that place. I love all of them and advocate for each one of them. One of the things we set up last week that I want to make sure we kind of bring back into the freshness of mind. I don't know about anybody else, but it feels like we've been a month since we were together. It's a long time between times during the pandemic. And so I want to make sure we kind of recap a little bit of last week. One of the things I did for you was lay out our understanding of the first century world, that there are multiple different groups. There is kind of a Jewish group, a group of the God-fearers and God-followers that are a Jewish group in that first century world to which Paul is writing. There's a group of kind of Gentiles. These are going to be civilized people. When Paul uses the word Gentiles, he's not talking about the barbarians. He'll talk about the uncivilized ones as well. That's kind of another group. But the Gentiles are people who live and act in the Roman world, but they are a diverse group from different places and aren't all a homogeneous group, especially not in the city of Rome. And so when he's writing to this group, he's writing to different groups. And what he's trying to figure out is to how to get these people who are Jewish by their ethnic identification and self-identification. He's trying to get these people who are Gentile. Some are Roman citizens, some are not. By that time in history, many people in the Roman world had been made Roman citizens, even if they weren't native-born people for Rome. And then he's trying to talk to the barbarians, and he's saying that all of these groups that have been there and are all different, that there's a unity, a oneness for them in Christ. And so the whole trajectory of this book is to show the kind of the oneness of the people who are going to be God followers in this Jesus movement, and call them to actively support by their behavior, by what they do, the ministry of Jesus in the world. And so, as I explained last week, from the author of the Hermenia series, Robert Jewett, who I was blessed to get to meet, I got to learn a lot about, at one level, the book of Romans is a very well-written stewardship letter. It's how to use your resources well. And you're going to see that throughout the book, him making an appeal to the people in Rome to help support Paul's mission from where he is to the world. And in fact, we just had left off in verse 15, where he's explaining that because he's been blessed by God to have this debt that he needs to pay to both the Greek and to the barbarians, that because of the debt he has in grace, he needs to go to the whole Roman world. And if you look back in the book of Acts and you read chapter 15, you read about a Jerusalem council, a gathering together of all the Christian thinkers and minds at the time. And they kind of all agree that Paul needs to go out to the ends of the earth, to the Gentiles, and to take the gospel to them. And I mean, think about it. It kind of makes sense. I mean, you can imagine what it would be like of who's your favorite enemy? I mean, who's the person most out to get you? That person shows up on your doorstep, and you know their reputation. They've been trying to round up and kill your friends. And they come and say, you know what? God got hold of me, and I'm called to spread the gospel. Well, what do you do with them? You don't really trust them to come to all the secret meetings, right? Because remember, they can all be thrown in jail and basically stoned to death for claiming that Jesus is the Christ. And so what you do is you say, well, hey, we think that this other group out there, the Gentiles, our believers, why don't you go to them, and then we'll see after a decade of you doing that well, whether or not you come back into Jerusalem. Okay, and so that's what Paul is doing. Okay, so this is what's going on at the time. So just as we kind of look at that, there's some other background music I want to set up for today's lesson. Since we're now all experts on understanding the first century world, we're going to kind of now get in there and look at a few things. One of the things is that we've got these groups and things. The other thing I want us to think about as we kind of get into this text and really drill down into its meaning and try to understand it is really, how do we expect to find the Bible speaking to us? Okay, so some of us really wish the Bible was as clear as the Ten Commandments are, right? Right? I mean, that's a lovely part of the Bible because there's no doubt about what it says, what it means, and that God very clearly in both renditions of it, God said these things, right? And so we're supposed to understand that here are some very clear directives. It's also behavioral, things we can do, right? We're to love the, it's thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, right? And anybody, I mean, like, all right, I don't want to kill, right? Killing is bad, right? We don't want to do it. Hating a neighbor, lying about them and getting them in trouble with the authorities is bad, right? I mean, don't steal stuff. I mean, these are great things. What's a little bit different in how we understand Romans is going to be that we're going to be reading an argument that Paul is making in a specific form. Okay, it's called a diatribe, diatribe, a diatribe, okay? And what he's going to do is he's going to say continually throughout the book, you've heard it said, and then da 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 da. You've heard it argued of these things. And he's going to go on and on and on about that. But what's confusing is he's not saying that that's the right way to think. He'll then say, therefore, here are the implications of that. And the problem we have is those aren't the right way to think. He'll then say, but God says, or I say, this is the right way to think. And he goes big on that, right? The challenge we have is all of it's in our Bible, the whole argument, right? So if you cherry pick parts of it and don't read it in its whole trajectory, you miss it, okay? The other thing is, and I'm going to say something here, and if you hate me for it, I'm sorry. I hope you'll forgive me for telling you something. Paul is a first century Jewish dude, okay? And he has first century Jewish dude understanding of the world and sensibilities. I have a good friend of mine who taught me New Testament in one of my semesters, Joette Basler. She is a first-rate scholar, even though she went to Yale. So don't count that against her, okay? But she is brilliant, lovely human being. She wrote a book called Navigating Paul. And she set out these trajectories about what Paul really meant. And at the end of the book, Paul meant what she would mean if she had written it. And so I sat down with her in a class, and I mean, she's a first-rate scholar. If you read from the NRSV version and you look at the editors of the NRSV version of the Bible, she is one of those people, right? You could find her name on some of the lists, and it depends on, she's in the HarperCollins edition of it. She was their version. So if you have an Oxford one, it will have probably a different list of people, but she, on the HarperCollins one, like, she's who they chose to help, like, make sure the edition came out properly. Like, she's that well known in the community that does translation. But I thought it was really convenient that Paul ended up with her sensibilities. And she said, you know what, Brad, that's the only legitimate complaint I've ever heard about my book. Because I sat in her office and we got to visit about it. But that doesn't, that what I get kind of am getting at, she's a first-rate scholar on a lot of other things, but what I want us to do is when we go encounter Paul, we're going to see ourselves or things we think are talking about us in specifics. And instead, what we really need to look for is, how is Paul thinking? And I want to let you know that what we need to pay attention to is not just the specifics, but what Paul is saying about faith, about hope, about love, which he would call salvation. So again, if you hear the word in here, salvation, he means faith, hope, and love alive in the believer. These are gifts from God that the Spirit gives you. And for him, it's not a smorgasbord. You don't get to go through and pick out a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's full stop. These are gifts of the Spirit we're given. But what he will do is he'll have first century dude understandings of how we're living our lives. But I just want you to know something. Paul thinks all of us are doing it wrong. Full stop. So just as we move through this, we're going to get to a couple of lists that when you read them, your ears will burn, or you'll be like, oh, wow, I didn't know that was in there or whatever, or different things. But remember, all of us are on the list for Paul. Paul wrote a list that meant that everyone he was writing to in that first century Roman community was getting it wrong. And oh yes, if you're pretentious enough and full of yourself enough to think you're righteous, you're really getting it wrong for Paul. And he's going to push you over to say, look, you are taking for granted the grace of God and God's kindness. And it's the kindness that we have that is how any of us are able to live at all. It is the grace of God being made known through love that changes everything. And this is only accessible to Paul through faith, okay? So you heard me mention faith, hope, and love again. But what I want to, and I pointed out to you that any time in the introduction we see faith, hope, and love, that we need to pay attention to Paul leaving out any, right? If he just leaves out one, you know that the rest of the book is going to be about that. So in the intro to Colossians, when he lists them, you know, and then all of a sudden the whole book of Colossians is about hope. But at the beginning, he says, basically, I've heard about your faith. I've heard about your love. Now let me tell you about hope. You got to have hope, right? And he's going to talk about faith, hope, and love like that. What's really cool and where Romans kind of is tricky or fun is he really focuses on, I've heard about your faith. And now he's going to really, he doesn't even mention hope and love in the intro. And he's going to give us all of them. But boy, he is really going to go after them on saying, you think you have faith. I've heard about how you think you have faith, but you really aren't dwelling in the grace of God. Okay. So when we read Paul here, our trick or challenge is, one, if I'm talking for Paul, I'll try to be really, really clear so you don't think I'm talking for Brad, right? I'm going to kind of say what I think he would have thought, right? And then I will talk for me if you have questions for me about different issues, okay, that he raises. The next part too is going to be the second part of that, is that let's not try to make him into us. Let's not try to you know, if he came here, his culture shock, he wouldn't believe that I have a Bible that has straight pages. He'd never get over that the pages are so neat and orderly. So many things are different about our world today. It would take a while. The idea that I'm talking to y'all and y'all are all over the place, and that is, I mean, that would just be mind-boggling to Paul. So I'm going to leave him in the first century out of love, and I believe he's in the communion of saints with the Lord, right? And I'm going to let him hopefully be in that place where he deserves to be, not try to talk for him, okay? But instead just try to show you what he wrote in that context, what it meant and why it was written that way, okay? All right, that's a lot, and I know that can give you a pain in the brain, and now we're about to start reading, so we're just gonna dig into it. But I think I got my intro in. Did anybody have any specific questions about my kind of setting the table before we go to Romans 1:16? You just raise your hand like that on the screen. Julia's watching for me and can answer any questions. I did so perfectly that nobody had any questions. All right, all right. Well, let's jump on into it then, and we're at verse 16, and I'll get about I don't know 4 words in. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. So, what an interesting way to begin. What do you, I mean, when we think about it, it's like, what do we think the gospel is? Like this, so we know the word gospel just means good news, right? So we understand that the word gospel is good news. The word gets used in the Roman world anytime there's an announcement of a birth of a royal. So anytime that somebody is being born to the emperor's family, a prince in a region, a director, of a son of a prefect, they would put out a gospel, a good news, a note to the public to let people know that someone important had been born. Okay, so he is saying a gospel, the news, the kind of the how to say the Twitter feed of the ancient world, the gospel about Jesus, the news about him is something that he is not ashamed of. So what possibly could he have been ashamed of? Well, most of us don't think about it because we use, how many, I mean, like for me, like when I was raised in the South in my time of growing up in this area, I think that the cross is like a telephone pole size, right? I grew up in the land of big churches, right? I thought Jesus must have been 100 feet up in the air when he was on the cross, right? Because in my mind, I'd seen steeples and I'd seen all these things way up in the air. But the thing about the cross was Jesus was only about 3.5 feet from Mary at the most, based on archaeological evidence that we have from other crosses in the first century that the Romans used. And it was one of the worst forms of capital punishment that had ever been devised. So much so that Cicero, when talking about it, felt like it should be abolished and not allowed for any citizen of Rome, that it was only for those who were treasonous and the worst possible criminals. So to make a peculiar claim that one, there is a human being who is God, based on what they do and who they do and whose son they are. Okay, the Romans knew that. They had people who were gods, all of gods, demigods, people born to one parent was a god and one parent was a human. They were like, okay, cool, we're down with that, right? For the Romans, what the offense of Jesus was is the idea that God was crucified. There is no more dishonorable death than crucifixion. It's an offense to them, saved only for the worst people. Okay? Who was the worst of the worst, according to Paul's writings? Paul. Paul thinks he is worse than anyone he will list. He knows that he wanted in his heart to kill the followers of Jesus and bring them to his version of justice, to have that movement expunged, wiped out, destroyed. And so when he's writing to people who are being judgy about other people, he's going to put an end to that, okay, in a not so succinct manner. And so I'm just kind of building the tension for you, and we'll get to it in just a minute. But when he says unashamed, he is saying that anyone who judges another human being is actually engaging in a kind of peculiar sin of basically being ashamed that Jesus was crucified for everyone. So anytime our first reaction to another person isn't love, we're missing the boat. I mean, don't even get into what's right or wrong or righteous or not righteous. I mean, don't even go there yet. The very first thing he's saying is that act of love on the cross, the offense it took on and became, is so profound that if our first response to every person we encounter isn't a loving charity, a kind of a benign, heartbreaking and bursting open in love, that we are really falling way short of who we're called to be as followers of Jesus. Now, the part that's challenging enough, right? And it becomes hard because we'll try to apply it to different groups or types of people, because we still want to, in our mind that formed over thousands of years out of families into tribes, into nations, into these bigger things, we want to organize our world by types of people or different ways we can kind of make them into this or that. And it's hard because we'll want to put them in those different groups and then judge or not judge them accordingly. But the worst part about this is Paul even says we have to be loving and nice to our family. Like those that like we don't want to call. Like, I don't know about you, but I got a couple of cousins that if I ring them, you know what they're going to do? They're going to ask me for money. Right? So like, I just don't even want to make the call, right? I mean, and yet what's my disposition to them? Is it judgment? Okay, for Paul, we can't do that. For Paul, everything has to be out of love. So that's what he's saying when he says about the offense of the gospel, because you're going to hear that theme throughout. And I want you to have sometimes I'm going to spend some time especially in these first few chapters, kind of setting that stage, because it's a theme throughout the book that you're going to hear over and over. Okay. All right. So not ashamed. The other thing of the gospel, it is the power of God for salvation. Okay. And here, I really want to kind of drill down on this idea of power salvation. Okay. For Paul's way of understanding, any person who has the love of God alive in their heart, that person becomes one of the most powerful people in the world. So for Paul, the way any system is transformed is not just through actions at great levels of power and prestige, but it's the transformation of a human heart. And then when a human heart becomes open to God, like the God, the big G God, the big kahuna in the sky, that God takes an active interest in the individual whose heart is transformed by God. So at times, Paul's going to seem to call people to go into harm's way sacrificially, not to harm other people, which is what sets our faith apart in a profoundly important way, not to harm other people, but to sacrificially love people into the possibility that God might reform and transform their heart as well. And if you ever think that today, or the Houston of this 21st century we live in, has gone to heck in a handbasket, I want you to know that the first century Roman world was so full of selfishness, violence, and uncleanliness of every imaginable way of thinking that we don't even hold a candle to it. Okay, we can't even fathom. It's worse than any HBO channel you'll ever watch, or pick your favorite thing. Okay, and these things are not only public, but they're in the street, and that's all going on. So when Paul writes about what he thinks to be troubling, it's not because he's going to talk about don't be judgy and love first. He's not saying he doesn't think these things are wrong. He thinks they're wrong, but he lists all of them so that anybody who hears that is going to be offended, because all of them are part of it. And then he's going to flip it all over and basically make the argument to think in this terms of right and wrong by behavior is to miss the point of the love of God alive in hearts. But we don't get that till chapter 8. So I just didn't want you to quit the study in chapter 1, okay? All right, so let's keep going, all right? The other thing is salvation to everyone who has faith, okay, faith. I really want to kind of bring that forward in what is like salvation. It mean in Paul's writing, it really does mean kind of a nature by which a person has called out for help and been basically helped beyond anything they could have imagined. So it is very much out of the kind of the Hebrew understanding of the word, which is literally for someone who's in battle or distress to call. So it's like dialing 911. Salvation is the point at which the hospital arrives, right? The ambulance gets there. It's that kind of how many of y'all remember the old Western movies when the bugle and the cavalry charge would come in and save the day or whatever? It's that kind of notion of the divine act of God. So salvation is something for Paul that is a kind of in the present, but not yet. And you're going to watch, there's going to be a tension throughout Romans in that there is a saving grace at work in our lives that gives us what I would call now this is Pastor Brad talking to clarify, but I would call it a foretaste, a preview, if you will. It's like when my grandmother would fry up a whole mess of shrimp there and have it all ready for us before we got there, and she'd still be frying some and the potatoes there at the last bit, and she would take out that big platter of fried shrimp and she'd set it up there to put the potatoes on the other end, and she'd let me, because I was a cute little 3-year-old, she'd let me have a little bite of that shrimp before we all got to sit down at the dinner. It wasn't dinner time yet, it hadn't happened, but I got a little preview of what was coming, okay? And so that same thing is what's going on in in this understanding of salvation. For Paul's writing in the first century, now going back to Paul, any believer who has the faith of God transforming their heart will receive real salvation in the present and become actually an instrument of bringing that salvation to others. Okay, so like that's a part of it. There is no passive Christianity in Paul's writing. He is writing to people who are going to be both giving money, giving time, giving resources, also people who will be willing to martyr themselves. Now here, again, not harming others, but willing to sacrifice their lives so that others might come to believe. All right, so I can't really give you a one-to-one analogy of the radicalness and the depth of Paul's writings. But at the time he's writing, remember what I said last week too, that there's no building, there's no place. There are just a handful of homes and a network of people who are willing to understand the truth about who Jesus is. And that little group, they start out, they're about 20 in an upper room, right? and there's about 120 of them at that early time in Acts in chapter 2. And by the end, and by the time we're getting this, it's emerging that group is going to spread throughout the world. And in just a few short 100 years, about by 386, they're going to overturn the Roman Empire. Like, just crazy cool stuff, okay? So it's all here. So I am, that salvation is a real help. You can understand they believed that God was going to do something even through them, and they were willing to sacrifice anything and everything and risk it all unashamedly because it meant that God might do something even through them to help others be part of the kingdom of God. Okay. It is by faith, and that faith is not just a knowledge or assent. The word here is, in Greek, is the word pistis. If you want to write that down, it's Pistis. Pistis is the English translation of the Greek word. And pistis is the kind of faith we have or knowledge we have. It's not, say, today faith has become, I have faith that something will happen, means it may or may not happen. But the word pistis in other places in Greek is used to describe, I believe that the bridge will hold my weight when I walk across. It is very concrete. It means you've witnessed and seen other people do something, and you've come to know the reality or truth of something. And so one of the challenges we have in our modern faith is we believe that, like, well, there can be an assent for me, and then another person with other beliefs, well, they have their own worldview, and all these different beliefs are kind of different, and they don't all kind of mesh into one necessarily. Okay, for the Greek mindset, and especially for the Romans, and when Paul's writing, Paul is making an assertion about the world and how he thinks it is, not a set of options, right? He's saying salvation happens like this, just like I would say, if I want to get out of my office, I have to go through this door over here. Now I have two doors, right? So I have to choose one, but this one over here is the door that I have to go out of my office. So he's saying it matter-of-factly like that, even when he's talking about some big kind of heady issues about the world. And that's going to be, I know it seems like I'm just throwing you another nugget there of information. I promise you, as we go through the book, which I've read every day this week and last week, all the way through Romans, you're going to need that little piece of information. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. You've heard me talk about that this faith is to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, you remember I said there were three groups? It's in another book that Paul will actually include the barbarians, but here he leaves them out, and I think that's kind of telling because he's writing to who is in the church, or who he thinks is in the church at Rome. So it's kind of an important little thing, but he is writing to a group that he believes the ones that are going to hear are civilized and intelligent. Obviously, they can listen to the Greek language, because it was, again, the book of Romans was written in the Greek, the language of scholars, and then it was read aloud in the gathered group in the home in which the Roman church was founded. Okay, and then it circulated around a group of churches. Okay, for in it, the right, in this verse 17, for in it, right, so in the gospel, for in in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith. For faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith, right? Now, this is a really fascinating thing. So what is righteousness for Paul? Righteousness is made known through faith because the gospel brings righteousness. And for Paul, fundamentally, what the gospel kind of has at its core is shame. The shame of the cross. But he is not ashamed of it. So why is he not ashamed of it? He's not ashamed of it because by taking on the shame of the world, Jesus forgave everyone so that we might live together in love, no matter who we are, who we think we were, what we think we've done, that the love of God might abound, he'll say. And I just can't overstate how profoundly significant that is in the history of humanity. It's a radically different thought. Any idea of just preconceived families or tribes or nations or things that seem to give us identity cannot hold. Because once we enter our faithful relationship with God, God through the gospel breaks away anything that creates differentiation. So I'm going to share one of my favorite sermon illustrations about that right now. And I need your help. I need you to forgive me if I use this illustration again another time and you hear it twice. Okay, can you do that? I'm seeing smiles. I think that's a yes. Okay. All right. So, and also too, I just want to say, Julia Jordan is here helping me moderate the feed just like she was last. So if everybody can just give Julia a thumbs up and thank her for her good work. She's doing a great job with all our communications. I appreciate her being here. But yeah, so a friend of mine, his name's J.B. Jones. He's of blessed memory now. He was in his late 90s when I met him, and just a great person. The way I met him is the worship times and styles had changed at the church where I was sent to serve. And I went out to his house, and he wanted to give me personally $1,500 for Laura and I to have a vacation if I would change the worship times for him. Okay, I mean, he was a character, right? But he was going to write me a personal check. Even when I said no, that I appreciated his thoughts, but there was committees and people that were doing that. He said, well, I can make it for more, you know, like he's gonna make it happen. You know, he was a doer, a great guy. He told me stories of when he was a child. His family had a bunch of land in Orange, and they would but it was out in this undeveloped area that later where Bridge City would go. And he told me a story about 1908 having to walk a mule into Orange so he could sell it, even though he was only like 7 years old at the time. And you know, that experience of the mud squishing in his toes, walking around, walking down what would become Highway 67 there, and was just a glorified trail following the railroad track, right? I mean, and just this whole character of a person. But because of the time he was raised in, he confessed to me that he was a racist bigot, and he had a real issue with race. And he had asked me to pray for him about that. And so I told him I would. He had a stroke, and during the stroke, half of his body became paralyzed. And he went into the hospital, and I had gone to see him and pray with him. And when he spoke, he couldn't form words because half of his body didn't work. And I prayed for him, and I left. I go to see him. I mean, we thought he was passing. Did I mention he's in his late 90s, right? I went to kind of see him again a day later. He was sitting up, talking to me. Everything was great. He said, Brad, I have received salvation. I said, well, cool, JB, tell me about it. You know, like, whoa, that's what a pastor wants to hear. And he said, Victoria saved my life. I was like, who is Victoria? He said, she's the biggest Black woman you ever saw. And she came in and wanted to pray with me in a chaplain role from one of the Pentecostal churches there in Orange, had come to pray with him. And he said, when she came there to pray with him, he tried to say, no, ma'am, I don't want you to pray. But because he had a stroke, he couldn't form the words. And so he couldn't say, no, don't pray with me because I don't want to touch you, because he was that much of a racist. Okay. And at that point, she prayed with him. He said, Pastor Brad, she healed my body and God took away my racism. I can go to heaven now, he said. Because in heaven there will be everyone. What Paul does with the Jesus movement to help them move beyond tribalism is one of the greatest gifts by God to humanity that ever occurred. In Christ, there is no Jew or Greek, no Gentile, no male, female, no slave free, not even a Scythian. There are only people who are one in Jesus Christ because he has melted their heart of stone and turned them into the loving instruments and people of God to spread the gospel without shame to the world. Okay. And so now as we kind of, we'll keep reading next time. I didn't get very far. My timer went off. I get kind of wound up about this stuff, I guess. But I just think it's again, it's my favorite book in the Bible. But the righteous one will live by faith. And when we live by faith, it gives us the freedom to be crazy enough to love all people. All right. Well, I've got about 4 minutes, I think, by my watch after it just went off. And so does anybody have any questions for me? That was a lot. And anybody have any questions on all that?
So if you had a relative who was crucified, would that shame extend to all the extended families too, so you could not like hold your head up in proper society, if you will?
What a great question. Thank you so much. And would you mind saying your name so I can call people by name? I'm still learning who everybody is.
It's Amy Richards.
Amy Richards. Amy, thank you for that great question. It's fantastic. Yes, definitely. Depending on what level of society you were, if you were of a noble birth, especially a person like Cicero or any of the patricians, any of that top level of praetorians too, any of that top level of society, for sure. Anybody who had extended to them Roman citizenship, definitely. And then it would go, basically the amount of shame your family would receive would go down dependent on how shameful your family was already considered or not considered. Because just like people today, they'd be like, oh, well, that's just the people from that family, and they're always like that, right? So so it would go down. But yeah, it was hideous, it was horrific, and it would be, for usually in the Roman world, a punishment like crucifixion did not involve just the master of the home, but everyone related to them was also persecuted or tried in those ways. Yeah, justice there was for the whole family, and it was usually the way that. And again, we can get into. I don't have a. I will probably next time bring a whiteboard so I could do like little diagrams for you, but I can show you like kind of how the patriarchal system worked. And basically it was the head of the household. And a few cases that would be a female, but I think in most of the records I've read and in Cicero's speech about crucifixion, I think at one point he even says it's, and again, I apologize for the sexist nature of it, but he says something like, it's too hideous for women to have to endure no matter who they are. So crucifixion was really reserved for the men of that time. But yeah, patriarchy is alive and well. Paul is not again, I think I said he's a first century Jewish dude. And so he's going to have those sensibilities. But he is going to say some things that kind of challenge the culture and time he was raised in, especially on issues of male, female, and actually he is the reason why the Christian church, unlike other movements, of religiosity at that time actually claimed that women had souls. Right. So I went to, has anybody been to Meteora in Greece? They're on top of these concrete, naturally made, formed concrete pillars. They built monasteries up on the top to basically, when the Turks came in and conquered that area, they wanted to keep, and the Ottoman Empire kind of spread into that area, they wanted to keep their Christian faith. So they retreated up on top of these mountains where they've built these beautiful monasteries. If you watch, it's there in some of the old James Bond movies and things. But they're just fantastic. And one of them is a nunnery that is, I believe it's St. Stephen's. And what they would do is they would go down into the villages and bring the girl children up there to learn how to read, because the Turks in their belief did not believe that women should be educated. And so I got my daughter a cross from there to always remember the blessing of her Christian faith and our movement towards full inclusion of women in all parts of society. So yeah, there were some stumbles and major hurdles along the way that are problematic historically, but the understanding that men and women both were blessed by God for salvation. You're going to find that in Paul, you're going to find that in Romans, and that's really, he says some other things that get taken often to beat Paul up, but really for a first century Jewish dude, he is thinking some things that will correct that over time. And we call that the Holy Spirit. So thanks be to God for that. Yes, Sunny has a question for me.
Just go ahead and ask her to unmute her mic.
You need to unmute your mic on your end. Oh, okay. Yeah, and Julia's trying to help you by unmuting you.
Did that work?
Yes, there it is.
Thank you. All right, question. After someone in a family has been crucified, how far down after that does the shame follow the family in following generations? Does it continue, or does it just end right there?
Right. So it varies greatly from setting and situation. So in the Roman culture and first century world that we know, which by the way, I mean, just so you all know, I mean, I have a degree in theology and mostly about the Bible, but in my undergraduate work, I did a dozen hours on the ancient Roman world. So I do have some background in this. I'm not just speaking as as an outsider. I've also got a little master's work on it as well. So it was not part of my doctoral project. So I'm not a doctor in this, but obviously I've learned a lot about the first century world. And I've been to these places and stuff. But one of the things would say, it really depends. I mean, for some families, remember, Rome is an ancient place. Like, how long has Texas been around, right? I think when I was growing up, we had our sesquicentennial, right? That's 150, right? We're probably a little bit older than that as a place, coming past 200 bicentenary, right? Remember that at the time Paul is writing to Romans, the Roman world was 400 or 500 years old. So it was over twice as old as Texas. Okay, there were families that were shamed by their interaction with Romulus and Remus in the stories that were told about legend, that were still being shamed if they were a descendant of that 400 years later. So reputation, it depends on who knows it, who remembers it, and who survives long enough to tell other people about it. Also, too, like a lot of people, a good descendant can transform that. But then what everybody would say in this kind of shame-based culture was, well, you know what's really impressive about what they did isn't just what they did. It was that even though they were of this family, they still did this. The other thing, though, to remember about the first century world, remember, crucifixion was sedition. It was reserved a lot for people were crucified not just because they had been bad. You were crucified because you were overthrowing the Roman state. So crucifixion, if you're a murderer, that's pretty bad. If you're a rapist, you would be put up there. A petty thief, a criminal like that, who is just stealing stuff or doing things, no. But if you were keeping the Romans for collecting their taxes and therefore trying to undermine the authority of the state, you were probably put to death. The reason Jesus is going to be put to death is they think him and his movement are trying to overthrow the government. I mean, like that's the issue with him. And in those cases, they wouldn't. The Romans were pretty bad about this. They didn't kill the people they held responsible who actively took up arms. They killed their whole family line. Like, why is the son of David in Nazareth anyway? Like, why did he grow up there? Why did mom move up there right out of the house of David? Why did Joseph go up there? Well, the reason he's in Nazareth is it's a mountain town for safety, and it was a way to signal to the Romans, we're not trying to overthrow the government. We're only going to go down to Jerusalem on the religious things, and then we're staying way out here. Don't kill all of us. Okay, so the whole why he's in Nazareth, there is a prophecy about that, by the way, too, which is part of that. But the way you signaled that you may have been royal, but you weren't interested in overthrowing the authorities was you lived out in the hinterland. You lived up in Nazareth. Okay, so the shame could follow you for a long time. And then also, just like any, how many of y'all are familiar with the War of the Roses? Anybody study that part of English history and the English Civil War? If you do, any of the worst kind of parts of that, or even pre-French Revolution, the way their nobles would do all those kind of signals and hints. Barbara Tuchman has a great book called A Distant Mirror about the 14th century that I would commend to you. It's a great little read. All the nuances and maneuvering and wrangling that they did, the royals of the ancient time did, and the punishment for even in this country, the punishment for treason is death. Yeah, we just don't get the whole family like they would. The Romans, that they were not taking any chances. Does that help? Does that help answer the question?
Very much.
Thank you. Great questions. All right, well, friends, it's so good to be with you. And I was told I only have like 50 minutes, so I'm trying to like be concise. And I meant to get all the way to chapter 2 today, so I will have to readjust that for this evening. And I'll try to keep you all on the same timeline. But we appreciate you. I would just commend to you at least all of chapter 1 this week to reread and think through a little bit. But go ahead and read into chapter 2. And specifically, I would read all the way through at least chapter 2, verse 4, because next week that's what we'll be going toward. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Good. All right. Any other questions? I'm happy. I can stay as long as anybody needs to answer questions. But anybody who needs to go, please go in peace with the grace of God with you, and I'll stay and answer any questions you might have. Some people just don't like to ask questions in front of everybody. So if somebody needs to stay and ask one in front of a smaller group, happy to do that. Oh, Nancy has a question?
Just ask her to unmute her mic.
Yeah, Nancy, can you unmute your mic and we'll be able to hear you?
I think I just did.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Nancy. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. You said something really fast and I was trying to write it down.
Oh, yes,
And
ma'am.
that's okay. Did you say any believer who has faith in his heart will receive salvation? Was that the
Yes, yes, and I would say in their heart, I hope if I just switched over to male and female language, I'll use her and him interchangeably. But yes, in their heart, yes, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Just want to get that right.
right. And then what's important to kind of go with that is Paul's understanding of salvation. It's both a real help in the present for faithfulness, and then also for Paul, there's not going to be any difference. It's not just like what I was trying to get at is in our modern concept, our faith is a mind thing. There's no heart and mind separation in Paul. In Paul, you are what you believe and you do what you believe, right? He doesn't live in a land where people will talk about how much they love Jesus and then give the cable company all the money and not make a tithe to the church, right? I mean, so like there's not a disconnect, or we'll say we love Jesus and then we get home and we yell at our spouse or have the different things. In fact, a lot of people I know don't even turn on to memorial in either direction without fussing and cussing at traffic or something, you know? So for Paul, that's not conceivable. You can't, for Paul, he'll even say at a point, to say Jesus Christ is Lord with our lips, we can't even do that without the help of the Holy Spirit in our hearts. Okay, so he has a very different worldview. So what happens is people try to make a one-to-one, well, he says this is wrong behavior. They don't see it in the argument that says, well, like actually all of our behavior is wrong to Paul, you know, like, and it's only by grace that we get any of it. And so they make the book of Romans into a book of hatred that tells us how we're all bad. And that's not really what he's saying at all. He's saying God is amazing. Look at what God can do with any of us. And if you have a heart of stone when it comes to approaching someone who is having, you know, challenges, or they're not doing things right or all that, well, how easy is that for you to be mean to them when it's only by the grace of God that you're able to do anything right, you know? So like, he really tries to break down the differences in humanity.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but what a great, thank you for making sure you had that. That's a beautiful,
That's wonderful.
beautiful part. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm just happy that anything I said that quick was actually in a complete sentence. So that makes me happy. I'll try to keep it kind of going, but I just kind of get like, I'm so sorry. Well, I'm not really sorry about it, but I do get excited about it because it is the joy that transformed my life. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Any other questions for those remaining? Yeah. Yeah, Robbie. Yes, go ahead.
I have, I'm a little confused with my timing because Paul wrote to the Romans in what, AD about 57, something like that.
That's right. So you can really go anywhere from 49 to 59, depending on which time you think he was in prison. That's correct.
So that's when he wrote to the Romans. But now, I mean, we all know, we've seen everything. We know about how the Romans persecuted the Jews after Christ died and, you know, did all the horrible things to the Jews and put them in the Colosseum and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Where does that fit in this timeline? Was Paul writing before that, after that, during that? I'm a little confused with where this is falling in that part of history.
Right. No, thank you. What a great question, Robbie. So yes, so when the persecution begins, the first real issue is going to start about 100 years before Jesus. Okay, so when you talk about, and in fact, there are going to be parts of what's often called the Apocrypha, the books the Protestants left out, right? These kind of books that were written about that time of the Maccabean revolt, that happens a good 60 years before Jesus, so it'd be about 100, let me just round off, say 120, and you can look it up exactly to get that. There's a big battle in Galilee and stuff. And from unlike kind of in our day and time, if we think something goes more than 5 or 10 years, it's gone on forever. Back in that culture, in that time, conflicts would last hundreds of years. And in this case, you're right in the kind of the midst of it. In a few years after Romans is going to be written, you're going to have the temple in Jerusalem in around 67 AD be completely destroyed and decimated. Okay, so the Romans are going to, literally, one of the Roman emperors, I believe it's Tiberius, when he sacks Jerusalem, he goes in and goes into the holiest of holies and crucifies basically, he doesn't crucify, he guts a pig because he knows they consider it unclean, and basically holds a barbecue in the holiest of holies to really demonstrate his lordship over the Jewish nation and people, and really tears down everything. And he's gonna destroy everything basically that King Herod had helped build. And here, Herod is a fascinating figure as well. You know, he's going to be just right at the beginning of Jesus, and then his son is the one that's mentioned in Acts. But the thing about him is he was in some ways also subversive, and that he got along with the Romans for the season to try to then build these places and power bases so that future people could actually help overthrow Rome and get the Romans out. So the Romans have fun relationships with everyone, and they're very distrustful and oppressive in how they rule. Remember that when they talk about the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, they mean peace at the end of a sword, because we're in charge and you're not, and you're going to do what we tell you to do. But I hope that helps. I mean, so the fight with them, it's going to go on really, in fact, with Masada a little bit later. Yeah, it goes kind of all the way through this era. So there is real tension in the time that Paul's writing between Jews and Gentiles. There's not, at the time Paul is writing, an open conflict or active war. There are some people still in the hills. There's Essenes. There's groups that have pulled away into the mountainsides, kind of like people who go to Idaho and try to hide out and act like they're their own little autonomous group or vigilante group. There's that kind of stuff going on, but there's not an actual revolt going on when he's writing.
Sort of a precursor, still trying to encourage Christianity among the Romans at this time.
Oh yeah, completely. And in fact, throughout from Paul on, and what's so wild is they're going to be so successful that they're going to topple it. Now, one of the things the Romans had done pre-Paul that is really fascinating is the Romans love things that are old. And so anything that has stood the test of time. And so what they've done is they've actually legalized the Jewish faith and made a special kind of, like, once there's a few hundred years of fighting, then there's the big Maccabean revolt, and the Romans they're pragmatic problem solvers. And that's what really makes them so effective. You see it in their architecture. They didn't invent anything they used to build. They didn't invent concrete. They didn't invent the arches that they use. They just used them more than everyone else and got better at it, because they're like, oh, well, if I take this and I take that and I put it together, I can do these great things. Well, what they do is they go into to conquer Israel. They have some troubles and stuff like that, but they're smart enough to get to the bottom of it. Oh, so if we don't make them worship our emperors as gods, if we don't have them have to be part of the civil religion, we can make a way that they can be peaceable and we can kind of keep them under wraps and they'll still pay their taxes. Okay, game on, right? Because the Romans wanted the money more than they wanted obedience from these people. Now, some emperors are noticeable to Tiberius, noticeable difference, right? I mean, if somebody named Tiberius tries to rule, just get out of the way, you know, you're going to get in trouble, okay. But that's how they kind of play it and do it. Yeah, I mean, that I think gives you a little feel for it. But they're really problem solvers, and they had made a dispensation for Rome, and then for the Jewish people. And then what Paul is trying to do is he can talk about Jesus in synagogues. That's not against the rules. What's against the rules is making Jesus divine, right? Saying Jesus is God. And what's against the rules are when he field preaches, like when he meets Lydia and he's talking to her out in the open air. That's against the law. Okay, so when Paul's spreading things, he's trying to navigate the thing. I mean, what we know about Paul's evangelism is there's this famous scene in Acts, and we'll probably teach on it sometimes. But yeah, where the goddess Diana is being worshipped, and they claim that him interfering with the idol trade has meant he was blaspheming and saying words against this goddess. And Paul's response is very fascinating. He had been spreading the gospel of Jesus, and he says, when did I ever say a single word against your God? And they had to take that back and say, yeah, you're right. Paul's never said anything against our God. Instead, he's just spoken about Jesus. Boy, I wish more of our churches would learn that, right? Let's focus on the truth of what we've come to know and the love that has transformed our heart instead of yelling foul about what everybody else is saying. And crazy thought for me, what if we lived some of it? You know, wouldn't that be cool? But I'm still working on that. So I'm still a work in progress. All right. Well, any other questions, friends? When we're in person, I can always stand around afterwards and answer questions for a little bit. But any other things that y'all have today? I know it's coming up on 11/11. So. All right. Well, thank y'all very much. She's going to end seeing no more questions. She's going to end the Zoom call, but it's such a blessing to be with y'all. And I look forward to when we're able to return this class to in person. The challenge right now is we don't quite have a room big enough, but you know, I look forward to visiting with you. If you have any questions through the week, please feel free to shoot me an email or let me know, and I'll do my best to get back to them in a timely manner if I can. Regrettably, I'm still, as I'm learning things, I'm still kind of under the replying to what's urgent first, and then working down to good questions. But thank you all so much. It's good to see everybody. I hope God blesses you, and see you next week.
See you next.